Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're flipping through a story talking about the southern border and the caps that could be put in place on certain visas. And of course, we're going to be finishing today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. We're going to get straight into it, obviously. Do you think that the U.S. government should reformat its visa program? Any ideas? Throw them down there in the comment section. I'm pretty sure the answer for most people is yes, but take it one step further. What do you think we should change? If you're very knowledgeable and you believe there are massive changes, love to hear what you have to say. Love to pick your brain about it, because obviously I am not the foremost expert, but I do have ideas myself, which we will delve into as we go through this article from our friends at Breitbart. Headline reads, Wall Street Journal, Trump should end H-1B visa caps now that southern border is secure. And the Wall Street Journal and its opinion/editorial board lean a little bit more in one direction rather than the other. If you could guess, it's to the right. But they also have a strain that is much more old right to them. And this is where the H-1B conversation comes out. Because a lot of older Republicans, and what I mean by that is not necessarily in age, but older style Republicans, maybe a little bit more neocon, would say, hey, immigration is okay as long as it is legal, as long as they're becoming naturalized, or as long as they are being productive and adding to the overall GDP or at least social fabric of the nation, which in some respects is a very conservative argument. It's a very libertarian, classical libertarian policy of not necessarily letting borders hinder the movement of people simply by blocking them out, but saying there will be a process to let you in. And then the conservative part of it comes on the social side, which is if you add to the social fabric or if you add to the economy, which is another relatively free trade or free monetary interaction between cultures and societies sort of view, if you're giving them the benefit of the doubt and you're not trying to be too critical of them. Well, now the editorial board is coming back and saying, okay, now Donald Trump, you got it locked down, man. You have the border on lock. How about you actually take the time to revise our H-1B visa program so that we can ensure that we are not necessarily losing the segment of the population that would be producing certain goods or bringing in extra population in general that can be a workforce, or if you don't want to be that base about it, at least sending money back more easily, that they're already getting taxed on their wages, but then they get taxed on their remittances as they leave the country as well. There could be lots of different arguments there on that side of the aisle. I'm not trying to imply that Wall Street Journal goes through all of them, but Breitbart tries to give a little bit of pushback here, so I want to go through their first paragraph after the big quote they take from the Wall Street Journal. Quote, the newspaper's illegal equal bad, legal equal goods message comes as Trump deputies are charting a course back to lower immigration, high productivity U.S., away from the post-1990 cheap labor economy that transfers ordinary Americans' wages into profits for quarterly CEOs and Wall Street investors. And if you want to take the Wall Street Journal as the mouth of Wall Street, then I think you could very well work your way to that exact same point of view that Breitbart is espousing. And that's not to pretend, that's not to go through this article and try to nitpick and say, oh, well, they're wrong here, they're right here, their view could be more nuanced here. What they're trying to lay out is a very thorough perspective on border crossings and immigration, that it actually ends up undercutting American markets and it actually does not incentivize innovation, which I thought was a pretty interesting argument, because normally people on the MAGA right want to use this as an example of people undercutting wages and then go on to explain how when these immigrants are not necessarily allowed into the United States, more American workers will take up those jobs. I would say that those jobs are not necessarily ones that can handle higher wages, not always, but in most cases. And since Americans' standard of living is higher very often, they are going to need, or at least want to be paid more. Therefore, there will be a lot of demand for people to work these jobs, but not necessarily enough supply, which can mean one of two things. Either prices have to go up because the companies, they have to actually meet that demand somehow, which means they make it more appealing. They actually make the wages higher or add more benefits, meaning there are higher costs, which means those get passed on to the American consumer. So the end product, whether it uses those inputs or just the goods themselves, actually become more expensive. Or you have an inverse product here, which is companies find other ways to actually fill that gap because they can use maybe things like robots or automated software programs, things like this. So actually pushing companies to innovate and find ways to keep their product cheap while also still sometimes bringing on more help and more workers, or in some cases not bringing on more workers and completely innovate their processes in order to be completely automated, or the people that are needed to do it are fewer because they have better equipment or more advanced equipment due to innovation. And I feel as though, obviously, it's not fully sculpted out. There still are knock-on effects of not having immigration, but, or at least higher immigration than we already have. Their idea is a relatively well fleshed out argument on why not to have immigration, and it is one that, as a person who thinks all illegal immigration should be punished extremely strictly, if you do not have your visa or your green card, I've said this before on the podcast here. If you do not have that on you and you cannot necessarily prove you are a citizen, you should be detained, and then you will have to go to court to actually prove that you are a citizen or not. And these can be quick hearings, basically pulling up the database and saying, we do not have any information on you based on what you've provided to us. We are going to deport you. And then I think we should make the process of legal immigrants who actually want to naturalize a little bit quicker. That doesn't necessarily mean we open up the asylum party, because the thing with the asylum program is a little bit different. You can say that you want asylum from another place without necessarily wanting to completely integrate within the U.S. culture, versus people who want to come here and be naturalized and therefore able to get green cards, actively contribute to society, not just through wage taxes, but other sort of programs that actually benefit the overall society. And you're also talking to somebody that recognizes that cutting down on this migration could very well undercut certain industries, and would be totally happy with increasing the amount of automation that we have within these sectors. So as someone who hasn't necessarily heard this argument before, but has continually brought up the point that to the people who are truly anti-immigration, period, full stop, and want to halt as much immigration as possible, that you will actually have to increase automation. I'm happy to see there's somebody else out there also pushing back and making the argument that this is actually what we should do, and that's a positive repercussion of the decision. And while it doesn't necessarily 100% resonate with me, because I can't say that I agree with every single point they make, it is one that is important to have out there in the conversation, in the pool of options. And it is also beautiful, in my opinion, that such a divisive issue actually comes up, or at least makes policymakers and the American people think about these different repercussions. Very often, Americans in the past have been afraid of the automation of certain processes because they feel as though it could take their jobs. For a long time, I feared that myself. I actually chose a career path that I thought intentionally insulated me a little bit from that, because the job I thought I had was, in my opinion, not replaceable by machines, AI, so on and so forth. And just like everybody else, I had a fear about it. But as I've gone on throughout my career, and I say that my career, I am young, of course, but I've grown to appreciate some of the tools that are actually increase my productivity and not necessarily replace me. And I wondered about the possibility of this being the case in other places. And also, in order to make my worldview, or at least my opinion, coherent as to why immigration won't necessarily, limiting it won't necessarily have terrible knock-on effects, you have to provide rational reasons for this, and you have to provide solutions, not just say there's a problem and not necessarily give us a path out of it. So I think it's fascinating. I would really suggest that you go read this article. It's not the most thorough in the world, but it could lead you on to a few other articles that are fascinating and allow you to explore this in a more in-depth fashion. And you may not necessarily like Breitbart, you may not necessarily like the Wall Street Journal, but at least give it a chance. Really try to put your feet into other people's shoes in this case, or put your brain into somebody else's skull, so to speak, and actually take in the argument and see whether or not it fits, whether the jacket fits, and you could actually see a reasonable solution coming out of something like this. But hey, that's just my opinion on it. Let's jump into our daily delight. This one is definitely going to leave a smile on your face, though you might be a little bit hesitant at first to admit so. I think that our friends over at Doggos, sorry, that's not actually fair. Their name is not Doggos. I just wanted to call them that. But our friends at Dog Time, the headline reads Amanda Seyfried's dog Finn, breed, age, and more. And honestly, this dog looks a little bit sassy in the first photo. It talks about some of the trips that they've gone on, what they get up to, what the Mean Girl star has done with their dog. I think it is adorable, and to pretend as though it's the best cute article that I've ever provided, no, I think the buns are pretty good, but this one will still leave a smile on your face, and it will at least leave you thinking about what the stars get up to with their dogs. So with that, if you want to read that article, or you want to read our article from Breitbart, you can go down to the description. Down there will be the link to those articles, as well as the links to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, and the Twitter handle, which is at Your Daily Flip, where I post links to both these episodes that come out on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, as well as the 6 and 6 segment, that is 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less, international news, and that comes out on Tuesday and Thursday. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.